Can a movie be doomed before anyone sees it? Today, we're talking about how glitter became one of the most infamous box office bombs in modern history. Before we talk about what went wrong, we need to understand what glitter was supposed to be. The film follows Billie Frank, a talented singer who escapes a traumatic childhood to pursue her dreams in the music industry. She's discovered by a nightclub DJ named Dice, who becomes both her producer and her boyfriend. As Billie's star rises, the relationship becomes controlling and abusive. She's exploited by the very people who promised to protect her. Eventually, she has to choose between her career and her sense of self. Sound familiar? Glitter was loosely autobiographical. Mariah developed the project herself and had been trying to make it since 1997. The parallels to her own life were impossible to miss. She grew up in a difficult home environment. She was discovered while singing backup for Brenda K. Starr when someone slipped her demo to Tommy Mottola, the head of Columbia Records. He signed her immediately. They married in 1993. The marriage was controlling and isolating. Mariah later referred to their mansion as Sing Sing, describing both her feeling of imprisonment and the constant directive to sing. By the time Glitter went into production, Mariah had divorced Mottola and left Columbia Records. The film was meant to be a declaration of independence, a way to tell her story on her own terms. But Mottola still had power. According to Mariah's memoir, he used his industry connections to sabotage the project. Columbia Pictures, a sister company to Sony Music where Mottola was CEO, insisted on rewrites that stripped away the grittier, more personal elements of the script. Her choice of Terrence Howard as her romantic lead was reportedly vetoed because he's black, and the studio wanted to whitewash the story. The original concepts she developed were rewritten into something very bubblegum, as she put it. Even worse, Mottola allegedly had promotional materials pulled from record stores and gave the sample she wanted for her lead single Loverboy to Jennifer Lopez instead. Mariah had to scramble to rework the entire song while already drowning in work. But the melodrama on screen isn't what made Glitter infamous. No, the real tragedy was everything that happened around the movie. Glitter's soundtrack dropped on September 11th, 2001. 10 days later, the film opened in theaters. That timing alone tells you everything you need to know about why this movie never stood a chance. America was mourning. The country was processing the worst terrorist attack on U.S. soil in history. The last thing anyone wanted was a sparkly musical about an aspiring singer in the 1980s club scene. But here's the most heartbreaking detail. On the day the soundtrack was released, Mariah was in a care facility recovering from her breakdown. She was so overwhelmed and disconnected from reality that she completely forgot it was release day. While she should have been celebrating the culmination of years of work, she was trying to piece herself back together, and the rest of the world was focused on something else entirely. The national tragedy that unfolded that day meant nobody was thinking about music or movies or Mariah Carey. The film opened at number 11 despite being the only wide release that weekend. It couldn't compete with movies that had been in theaters for weeks, like American Pie 2 and Rush Hour 2. By the second week, ticket sales dropped more than 60%. The final domestic box office total was just over $4 million against a $22 million budget. Mariah herself later said the release date was catastrophic, pointing out that nothing could have succeeded under those circumstances. She was right. Even SNL made jokes about how empty Glitter theaters were, suggesting the CIA should search for Osama bin Laden there because no one would be around. What most people forget is that other artists released albums that same day. Jay-Z, Nickelback, Bob Dylan, and POD all dropped projects on September 11. Those albums recovered. They found their audiences. Glitter didn't get that grace period because by the time the movie came out 10 days later, the narrative around it had already been written. Even before September 11th, Glitter was struggling to define itself. Was it a romance, a musical, a drama about fame and exploitation? The marketing couldn't decide, and audiences were confused. The promotional materials emphasized the glamour and the music, selling the film as a feel-good star vehicle. But the actual movie was darker, dealing with abuse, abandonment, and the cost of visibility. That disconnect made it impossible for the film to find its audience. People showed up expecting Whitney Houston's The Bodyguard and instead got something messier and more melancholic. Critics pointed to the predictable rise and fall storyline and familiar music biopic tropes, but those criticisms missed the larger problem. The film was marketed as one thing and delivered another. Audiences felt misled before before they even left the theater. The timing of the promotional push made things worse. Much of Glitter's marketing budget was spent in New York City, where billboards featuring Mariah in sequins and glitter stood in stark contrast to the somber, devastated mood after the attacks. The visual clash between the film's aesthetic and the national grief was impossible to ignore. Glitter didn't just fail, it became a symbol. The film turned into shorthand for celebrity vanity projects gone wrong, a cautionary tale the industry loved to reference. Over the years, it appeared on countless worst films ever made lists, not because anyone had actually watched it recently, but because the narrative had solidified. Virgin Records dropped Carey from her $100 million contract after the soundtrack underperformed. The EMI Group paid her $28 million just to terminate the deal. The message was clear. This failure was personal, and it was all her fault. Looking back, Mariah has expressed regret about signing with Virgin in the first place. She admitted that money was a major motivating factor and that she felt embarrassed about how much the financial offer tempted her. That $100 million deal sounded like freedom after leaving Columbia Records and her controlling ex-husband Tommy Mottola, but it came with enormous pressure and impossible expectations. Virgin needed blockbuster success to justify that price tag, and when Glitter couldn't deliver under catastrophic circumstances, they bailed. But that narrative ignores the structural issues at play. The film was pushed back 3 weeks after Carey's hospitalization, landing it directly in the post-September 11 climate. The script went through multiple rewrites during production. The acting coach reportedly inhibited Carey's performance. These were systemic problems, not the fault of one woman. Yet Glitter became a way for the industry to punish a successful woman who dared to expand her reach beyond music. It became a way to remind female pop stars to stay in their lane. Then something unexpected happened. In 2018, 17 years after its release, Carey's fans launched the #JusticeForGlitter campaign. A French fan named Kenny started a countdown to Carey's new album, Caution, by listening to her discography chronologically and sharing his schedule online. When he reached Glitter, other fans joined in. The fan account Mariah Trends encouraged people to buy the soundtrack, which wasn't available on streaming services at the time. Within days, Glitter climbed to #1 on the iTunes album chart, beating out new releases from Imagine Dragons and the A Star Is Born soundtrack. Carey herself was moved by the gesture. She tweeted the hashtag and acknowledged that the fans had made it happen, not her. For the first time, she started performing songs from the soundtrack on tour. The campaign represented something bigger than chart positions. It was fans reclaiming a narrative that had been used to humiliate and dismiss someone they loved. It was resistance against the idea that Glitter deserved to be a punchline. The reassessment hasn't turned Glitter into a critical darling. Most people still agree the film has serious flaws, but time and distance have allowed for a more nuanced conversation. Some viewers now see it as a film about exploitation in the music industry and the emotional cost of fame for young women. Others appreciate it as a camp artifact of early 2000s pop culture. The point isn't whether Glitter is good or bad. The point is that it deserves to be judged on its own terms, not through the lens of a national tragedy and a media circus. But here's the most important part of this story. Mariah didn't let Glitter define her. After Virgin dropped her from the label and bought her out of the contract for $28 million, she signed with Island Records. Her first album for them, Charm Bracelet, still struggled to find an audience. For the first time in her career, she released an album without a hit single. The industry was ready to write her off completely. Then came The Emancipation of Mimi in 2005. The title itself was a statement. Mimi was Mariah's nickname, and emancipation meant freedom from everything that had tried to destroy her. The album opened with It's Like That, a party anthem that announced she wasn't going to let anyone's drama bother her anymore. The second track, We Belong Together, became one of the biggest songs of the decade. It spent 14 weeks at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and reminded everyone why Mariah Carey was a legend in the first place. The Emancipation of Mimi sold 10 million copies worldwide. It earned multiple Grammy nominations and wins. It wasn't just a comeback, it was proof that the narrative around Glitter had been wrong all along. The problem was never Mariah's talent or her ability to connect with audiences. The problem was timing, sabotage, and an industry that punished women for being human. And she didn't stop there. Mariah became the undisputed queen of Christmas. Her 1994 song, All I Want for Christmas Is You, has become a cultural phenomenon. phenomenon, topping charts every holiday season and earning her a permanent place in pop culture history. The song that once felt like a novelty has generated hundreds of millions in revenue and proved that longevity matters more than any single flop. Today, Mariah is celebrated not just as a survivor, but as one of the greatest vocalists and songwriters of all time. She reclaimed her narrative, her career, and her legacy. Glitter's failure wasn't about the content on screen. It was about everything that happened around it. The September 11th attacks created an impossible cultural climate. The media turned Mariah's mental health crisis into entertainment. The industry used the film as a cautionary tale to keep women in their place. Her ex-husband allegedly sabotaged the project out of spite, and for nearly 2 decades that was the story. But fans refused to accept that narrative. They demanded justice for a film that never got a fair chance, and Mariah herself proved that one failure doesn't define a career. She came back stronger, reclaimed her throne as a living legend, and became the Queen of Christmas. She showed the world that resilience matters more than perfection. This is Ladies First, watching women in movies. Here, we empower women by reviewing and discussing films that highlight their stories, struggles, and achievements. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments.